People love to talk about crowns, but let's be honest. The real gossip is how badly things end for the people who wear them. A throne might look comfortable, golden even, but history shows it's basically the world's most dangerous chair. One man in Rome thought he was safe until 20 senators decided he wasn't. An English king gambled on a horse and lost both it and his skull. A Russian dynasty trusted basement walls that could not stop bullets. In Paris, a guillotine turned monarchy into stage performance. And in Bangkok, silence was broken by a single gunshot in a royal bedroom. Different times, different weapons, same result. Power never dies peacefully. And maybe that's the only thing you can trust about kings. The Curia Pompeii stood quiet on the morning of March 15th. Marble columns rose toward a roof that caught the pale light, and the polished floor carried the muffled echoes of sandals. Senators arrived one by one, their white togas rustling as they moved toward their seats. Outwardly, it was an ordinary day, but beneath the fabric of those garments, hidden in folds, were daggers sharpened for something far more than politics. Their greetings were polite, even warm, yet behind the smiles lay a tension that no one dared voice. Rome appeared calm, but the Republic trembled at the edges. Julius Caesar entered last, as tradition demanded. He was 55, weathered by decades of campaigns that had carried him across Gaul, Spain, Egypt, and beyond. Illness had weakened him in recent months, but he still projected an aura that commanded attention. To his followers, he was Rome's savior, a man who had restored order after years of chaos. To his critics, he was a tyrant in waiting, a monarch cloaked in the title of dictator perpetuo. His very presence divided the room. Those who admired him rose with genuine respect. Those who feared him rose as well, but their eyes darted toward one another, measuring the distance to their blades. The first strike came suddenly. Servilius Casca lunged at Caesar's neck. The attack was clumsy, poorly aimed, more shocking than deadly. Caesar reacted instinctively, grasping Casca's hand and shouting in disbelief. His cry reverberated through the chamber, the voice of Rome's most powerful man, startled not by an army, but by his peers. In that instant, the chamber dissolved into chaos. Senators surged forward, daggers flashing. The scrape of sandals and the tearing of cloth mingled with the metallic clang of steel against bone. Ancient sources claim that Caesar suffered 23 wounds. For centuries, this was taken as proof of a savage, merciless killing. Yet modern forensic reconstructions paint a different picture. Of the 23 injuries, only one, a deep thrust to the chest that pierced his lung, would have been fatal. The others were shallow, hurried cuts to arms, thighs, and back. They look less like calculated strikes and more like gestures, acts of participation. It seems most of the senators wanted to be counted as assassins, but few wanted to deliver the true killing blow. Violence here was political theater, daggers raised not only to kill but to prove allegiance. The most devastating strike came not from the sharpness of iron, but from betrayal itself. Marcus Junius Brutus, Caesar's protege, stepped forward. Caesar had trusted him, perhaps even loved him like a son. When Brutus raised his dagger, the assassination crossed from conspiracy into legend. Et tu, Brute? Whether the words were spoken hardly matters. History has preserved them as shorthand for betrayal, echoing through centuries. Caesar slumped to the base of Pompey's statue, the rival he had once defeated in battle. The irony was cruel, almost staged, as if Rome itself demanded symbolism at the cost of flesh. When the last blade was withdrawn, silence fell. Caesar's body, draped in a bloodied toga, leaned lifeless against stone. His killers, hands trembling, daggers stained, fled into the streets proclaiming liberty restored. But liberty did not return. Citizens closed their shops, bolted their doors, and whispered in fear. The conspirators had expected gratitude. Instead, they found a city recoiling. Rome did not see saviors. It saw butchers. The irony is impossible to miss. These men believed they were saving the Republic by cutting down a tyrant, yet their knives performed no surgery. They carried out an autopsy on a system already dying. Caesar's body was gone, but the forces that had elevated him, soldiers' loyalty, public hunger for order, the collapse of Republican institutions, remained. They thought 23 wounds would heal the state. In reality, the chest wound that killed Caesar also bled out the last strength of the Republic itself. By midday, the streets buzzed with rumor. Some claimed Caesar had fought like a soldier until the end. Others whispered he had accepted death once Brutus struck. No matter the version, the conclusion was the same. Rome's most powerful man had been killed by those meant to guard its laws. The Curia's marble floor had become not a place of debate, but a crime scene, etched with blood. And from that crime scene, civil war would follow. The conspirators left the chamber certain they had delivered salvation. Their daggers were hidden again beneath folds of white cloth, their robes stained with the evidence of what they had done. They expected to be welcomed as heroes. Liberty, they believed, would be their reward. But the city did not cheer. Doors closed, shutters slammed, and frightened whispers replaced applause. Rome had seen violence before, but never like this. The most powerful man in the state struck down not by foreign enemies, but by the hands of his colleagues. Caesar's body was left on the marble floor for hours. The statue of Pompey loomed above him, cold and indifferent, as though mocking both victor and victim. Blood pooled at the base, soaking into cracks, staining stone that had witnessed centuries of debate, but never such betrayal. Eventually, attendants came to lift the body, carrying it away with quiet reverence. By then the news had spread through the city, carried in panicked voices from market to forum. No one knew what would follow. Some feared civil war. Others feared the return of chaos that Caesar's rule had briefly subdued. At the funeral, Mark Antony understood the power of spectacle. He stepped before the people with a calm that masked calculation. In his hand he carried Caesar's toga, ripped and darkened by blood. He lifted it high, pointing to each tear, each hole, naming the men who had struck. The crowd, already unsettled, grew restless. When he read Caesar's will, promising land and coin to the ordinary citizens, grief became rage. Antony had transformed a corpse into a martyr and a garment into a weapon sharper than any dagger. The crowd rioted, fires rose, and the conspirators' dreams of freedom collapsed in smoke. Forensic study centuries later gives weight to Antony's display. The toga bore real wounds that matched accounts of 23 strikes. But again, only one wound to the chest was truly fatal. To the people, the number was enough. 23 sounded like overkill, proof of cruelty, proof of treachery. They did not need medical precision. They needed symbols. In that sense, Antony was not exaggerating. He was amplifying what the crowd already feared. Brutus and Cassius fled Rome, their reputations torn as surely as the cloth Antony held aloft. They had thought of themselves as defenders of liberty, but the people saw butchers. Their cause unraveled, their support dwindled, and soon armies were marching. Civil war consumed the Republic, scattering the dream of restoration into dust. Looking back, the assassination tells us as much about psychology as it does about politics. Most wounds were shallow, cut into arms and legs, the marks of men striking quickly but without intent to kill. It was participation more than precision, the kind of violence where everyone wants to be part of history but Few want to bear the weight of ending a life. Only one or two conspirators dealt decisive blows. The rest performed gestures, and history judged them all equally guilty. The irony is sharp enough to make a toast over in any tavern. 20 senators believed they could save a republic with daggers. Instead, they guaranteed centuries of emperors. They thought they were stopping a monarch. They were, in truth, laying the foundations for Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Their actions killed not only Caesar, but the republic itself, though they lacked the honesty to admit it. Imagine the curia after the body was removed. The chamber empty, the blood scrubbed, the statue standing silent once more. It looked unchanged, yet nothing would ever be the same. The republic that had endured for centuries was finished, undone not by foreign invasion, but by men who believed they were saving it. Caesar's death became less about his body and more about the meaning others attached to it. Antony saw a martyr, Octavian saw opportunity, and the people saw the end of an era. And so the Ides of March remains a lesson carved into history. You can kill the man, but you cannot control what his death will mean. Caesar's body carried 23 wounds, but it was Rome that bled out. The conspirators declared liberty restored, but what they restored was silence, quickly replaced by the noise of riots, battles, and eventually the triumph of empire. In 2012, workmen peeled back a strip of asphalt in central Leicester, expecting nothing more interesting than Victorian rubble. White numbers flaked on the parking bays, autumn leaves blew in lazy circles, and a council sign warned about fines. Then a trench dipped, a trowel scraped, and bone emerged, first a femur, then a pelvis, then the curve of a spine twisted like a question mark. The skull lay tilted, bearing sharp-edged cuts that looked uncomfortably deliberate. Someone whispered the name no one quite dared to say aloud. Richard. Within hours, the rumor had a royal surname and a parking space number. England's lost king had turned up under a ford. To make sense of those bones, we have to ride backward 5 centuries to a damp August morning at Bosworth. Richard III, last of the Plantagenets, chose attack over patience. His rival, Henry Tudor, was untested but well-backed. Conventional wisdom said, dig in, let the enemy come. Richard preferred audacity. He saw a chance to end the war in a single stroke, cut through the press, find Henry, and kill him with his own blade. It was the kind of gamble rulers romanticize in speeches and regret in mud. He spurred forward, and the line buckled. The first rush worked. Richard's personal guard punched a path through billhooks and pikes, the royal banner swinging above helmets like a defiant star. Then fortune reversed the table. Allies hung back. An ambush reared from the flank, and the ground turned treacherous under hooves. A lance glanced, a horse stumbled, and England's king went down into the churned earth. He rose on foot, sword still in hand, the world a ring of steel and shouting. Chroniclers later admired his courage. Courage, alas, is a poor substitute for masked spears. Forensic evidence, patient and unsentimental, fills in what eyewitnesses dramatized. The skeleton unearthed in Leicester carried at least 11 injuries delivered at or near the time of death. 2 tell the clearest tale: a heavy-bladed strike cleaving the rear skull and a penetrating wound at the skull base. Either could be fatal. Together they read like a signature of battlefield execution. Several other cuts rasp across the crown and cheek. One sharp puncture marks the pelvis, likely inflicted after death. A small, nasty flourish of humiliation. The helmet by then must have been gone. Once the head is bare, a fight becomes a countdown. Shakespeare, bless him, made Richard a hunchbacked villain bargaining for a horse. The bones complicate the caricature. Yes, scoliosis curled the spine, raising one shoulder and twisting the torso. It would show in a doublet, disappear beneath armor, and ache on damp mornings. But this was no grotesque cripple. The limb bones are sturdy, the muscle attachments pronounced. He was capable, mobile, and, on the evidence, ferocious when cornered. If he begged for a horse, it was the practical request of a soldier outnumbered, not a coward clawing for an exit. Strip away the poetry and you get something colder. A man trapped in a ring of enemies, losing his helmet, taking blows to the skull until light goes out. The crowd that watched his corpse hauled into Leicester saw only the aftermath. Naked flesh slung over a horse, jeers tossed like rotten fruit, the swift shuffle from royalty to meat. He was buried in a friary grave, shallow and unmarked. No carved angels, no marble effigy, just soil, timbers, and the indifferent patience of time. Propaganda did the rest. A stage villain is easier to remember than a complex king. And yet the ground remembers what pamphlets forget. Down in the trench, archaeologists read taphonomy like detectives. Soil stains, cut edges, abrasion, the geometry of trauma. Scoliosis bowed the spine in that unmistakable S, confirming the chronic condition. Tool marks on bone whispered the shape of weapons, halberd, sword, dagger. The pattern matched Bosworth's chaos far better than any careful execution would. This was not a tidy beheading. It was a whirlwind finished with an emphatic final chop. The parking bay had become a courtroom, the skeleton its star witness. The real mischief came when genetics joined the dig. Mitochondrial DNA from living maternal line relatives snapped into place like a key in a long-locked door. Isotope readings hinted at diet and movement. Facial reconstruction lifted a plausible face from the skull, narrow, intelligent, decidedly human. No villainous kink of the lip required. Suddenly, rumor was on the back foot. Bones, it turns out, are stubborn narrators. They are not swayed by Tudor spin or theatrical thunder. They tell you where the blade landed and how many times. Does any of this absolve Richard of political sins? Not remotely, but it does demand we balance the ledger. He fought, and he died fighting. He bore a physical condition, and he bore arms despite it. He ruled briefly, and he gambled boldly, and the gamble failed. The rest, nephews in the tower, motives dark or pragmatic, belongs to courtroom dramas history will argue until the pub closes. What the skeleton insists upon is simpler. On that field, he was a king cut down in open combat. So hold the image: a quiet car park, numbered paint, a trench revealing a crooked spine and a shattered skull. Then, in the same breath, the muddy circle at Bosworth where a banner drooped and a crown vanished into clay. 500 years collapsed into a single breath of cold air rising from a Leicester trench. The battlefield silenced Richard with steel. The archaeology gave him back a voice. And, as ever, the truth sits somewhere between a playwright's scowl and a scientist's calm. When the bones were lifted from the Leicester trench, they carried the weight of centuries. Soil clung to ribs, vertebrae twisted in a telltale curve, the skull fractured but still eloquent. Forensic teams treated the remains with the same care given to any homicide case. Chain of custody, photographic records, careful cataloging, all applied, though the victim had been dead for more than 500 years. The irony is thick. Richard III finally received the kind of investigation denied to him in life. Radiocarbon dating placed the bones firmly in the late 15th century. Isotope analysis traced diet heavy in meat and wine, markers of high social status. The spine confirmed scoliosis, severe enough to raise one shoulder but not to cripple. Most striking of all were the trauma patterns. 11 distinct injuries, mostly clustered around the skull, testified to a man who died helmetless in combat. Cuts from swords, punctures from halberds, even dagger wounds at odd angles, all consistent with battlefield frenzy. Each mark was a signature left by weapons long rusted, wielded by men long forgotten. DNA provided the clinching evidence. Samples extracted from the bones were compared with living descendants of Richard's maternal line, including one retired Canadian carpenter whose genealogy carried an unbroken thread to the Plantagenets. The match was conclusive. Centuries of rumor dissolved under the clarity of genetics. The king under the car park was Richard, beyond doubt. Bones are stubborn witnesses. They do not care for Tudor propaganda or Shakespearean drama. Then came the reconstruction. Forensic artists built up clay muscle over a digital skull, mapping tissue depth and facial angles. Slowly, a face emerged. Narrow, high cheekboned, intelligent, almost delicate. It was not the snarling villain from the stage, but a man with thoughtful eyes, the kind you might expect to calculate risks and lose them. The public stared at the image and blinked. This was the face hidden beneath armor, the face that went down fighting in mud, the face forgotten beneath asphalt. What followed was less science than politics wrapped in ritual. The question arose, how do you rebury a king found under a car park? Leicester Cathedral became the chosen site. In 2015, Richard was laid to rest again, this time with ceremony, processions, and even television cameras. Crowds gathered to watch, some carrying white roses of York, others simply curious. Irony upon irony, the man dumped in a friary grave without dignity was finally honored in pomp he never enjoyed while alive. But the real meaning lies deeper. The skeleton forced a re-examination of reputation. Shakespeare's Richard was a monster, a murderer of nephews, deformed in body and soul. The forensic Richard was a man with scoliosis, yes, but also a warrior strong enough to fight until surrounded. He was not absolved of political sins, but he was granted humanity denied for centuries. Bones in their silence spoke louder than propaganda. There is a lesson here about how power shapes memory. Henry Tudor won at Bosworth, and his dynasty sponsored chroniclers who painted Richard in shadows. The theater sharpened the caricature, and for centuries audiences hissed at a villain who may never have existed in such form. Then a trench and a set of test tubes changed the story. Science, blunt and clinical, leveled the stage. And yet, there is also humor in the discovery. Imagine explaining to Richard, in the last seconds before steel split his skull, that 500 years later, he would be found beneath a car park, his story retold by geneticists and TV crews. He might laugh if he had breath left. He might mutter that history, like dice, always falls strangely. In the end, Richard's bones did more than confirm a death. They exposed the gap between myth and evidence, between theater and truth. He died as a king on the field, and he lived for centuries as a villain in plays. Now at last he rests as a man, flawed, brave, broken, and real. The Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg held a tense silence in the early hours of July 17, 1918. Oil lamps flickered weakly in the corridors, and the walls seemed to absorb the footsteps of guards moving with unusual purpose. Nicholas Romanov, no longer Tsar but still a father, was told he and his family would be moved for safety. He rose quietly, gathering his wife Alexandra and their children. They carried pillows, small personal belongings, even blankets, tokens of a journey that would never happen. Instead, they were led into a basement chamber. The room was bare, its plastered walls damp, a single shuttered window high on one wall. The smell of lime and kerosene hung thick in the air. 11 people stood crowded together. Nicholas and Alexandra, 4 daughters, the hemophiliac heir Alexei, and 4 loyal attendants. Chairs were arranged as if for an awkward family photograph. A guard unfolded a paper and read a decree aloud. The words condemned the Romanovs as enemies of the people. Nicholas managed to mutter only a bewildered, What? What? Before weapons were raised. Pistols and rifles fired at once. The sound in the confined room was deafening. Muzzle flashes lit the chamber in bursts of orange. Smoke rolled instantly across the walls. Bullets struck bodies, ricocheted off brick, and screamed back at odd angles. The executioners were blinded by their own smoke. Some bullets struck stone before striking flesh. The first volley killed few outright. Chaos followed. The daughters, clad in corsets stitched with jewels, were partly shielded from the initial shots. Diamonds and sapphires turned into accidental armor, deflecting rounds that would otherwise have torn into organs. They screamed, stumbled, and were finished with bayonets and pistol shots at close range. Forensic study of remains decades later confirmed the mixed trauma. Peri-mortem gunshot wounds, sharp force injuries, and marks consistent with stabbing. The basement was less an execution ground than a storm of panic and noise. Ballistics experts examining the case a century later point to the confusion of weapons. Rifles of 7.62 caliber, Nagant revolvers, Browning pistols. Each carried different muzzle velocities, different stopping power. Inconsistent firepower produced inconsistent results. Over-penetration sent bullets ricocheting across the room. Bone fragments later showed irregular entry angles, the signature of rounds bouncing unpredictably. This was no clean firing squad. It was a killing chamber clouded in gunpowder and fear. When the smoke cleared, groans still echoed. The wounded were dispatched with more shots and thrusts. The floor became slick with blood, the walls blackened by muzzle flash. 11 people lay dead. The last Tsar, the Empress, 4 daughters, a sickly boy, and the servants who had refused to abandon them. A dynasty that had ruled Russia for 300 years ended in a cellar smaller than a courtroom. The bodies were dragged upstairs and loaded onto trucks. Guards drove into the forest under cover of darkness. There, the attempt at erasure began. Corpses were doused in sulfuric acid, their faces disfigured to prevent recognition. Some were burned with kerosene, bones cracking in the fire. 2 children and a servant were buried in a separate pit, a diversion meant to confuse anyone who searched later. Forensic taphonomy decades afterward revealed the truth. Bones showed chemical etching, thermal damage, and soil staining consistent with shallow, hurried burials. In that clearing, the Romanovs were reduced to ash, fragments, and charred remains. There was no golden coffin, no imperial anthem, only hurried destruction carried out by men eager to leave no trace. Yet the evidence survived in silence. Soil carried residues of fire. Bones bore scars of acid. Even destruction leaves testimony for those who know how to read it. Rumors began immediately. Some whispered that Anastasia escaped, spirited away into exile. Others claimed Alexei had been smuggled to safety. The Soviet regime offered no clarity, releasing fragments of information but never the full account. Silence, enforced by fear, proved fertile ground for legend. The cellar in Yekaterinburg became less a room and more a myth, a place where stories of survival outlasted the truth of mass execution. That night in July was not only the end of a royal family, but the symbolic end of an empire. It was also the beginning of a mystery that lasted for decades. The walls of the basement were scrubbed, repainted, and eventually demolished, but the questions refused to vanish. Bones hidden in the forest waited like buried witnesses. Myths flourished where evidence was buried, but in time, science would exhume both. In the summer of 1979, 2 local geologists followed rumors into the forests near Yekaterinburg. They dug quietly, far from official eyes, and uncovered bones. The Soviet Union still breathed secrecy, so the discovery was not announced. Instead, the remains were reburied, their location marked only in memory. For nearly a decade, the bones waited underground again until political winds shifted. By the early 1990s, glasnost made secrets harder to keep. The grave was reopened, and scientists at last began to examine what had been hidden since 1918. The bones were fragile, burned, and incomplete. Forensic anthropologists laid them out in careful order, cataloging skull fragments, vertebrae, and long bones. The damage told a familiar story. Some bones bore traces of fire, others chemical etching from acid. Many showed perimortem trauma, gunshot wounds visible as round holes, fractures radiating like cracks in glass. Even after 7 decades, the skeletons whispered the violence of that basement. Identification was the next challenge. The remains were compared with historical records, ages, heights, and medical conditions of the Romanovs. Alexei's bones showed signs of hemophilia, fragile evidence in marrow and joints. Yet doubts lingered. Rumors of survival clung stubbornly. Had Anastasia escaped? Was Alexei hidden abroad? Myths resist silence. They thrive in the gaps of certainty. Science stepped into those gaps. In the 1990s, DNA analysis advanced far enough to tackle the case. Samples from the remains were tested against living relatives of the Romanovs, including Prince Philip, husband of Queen Elizabeth II, whose maternal line linked to Alexandra. Mitochondrial DNA provided the key. The sequences matched. The bones belonged to the Romanov family. The cellars dead had been found. But 2 children were missing. The grave held only 9 bodies, leaving space for legend. For years, conspiracy theories bloomed. Films romanticized Anastasia's escape. Novels gave her new lives in Paris or Berlin. The world preferred hope to horror. Even when the science pointed one way, imagination tugged in another. Then, in 2007, another dig in the same forest unearthed burned fragments from a second pit. 2 partial skeletons, small and delicate, were examined. DNA once again provided answers. The sequences fit perfectly with the others. The missing children, Alexei and one of his sisters, had been accounted for. With that, the myth of survival collapsed under the weight of bone and sequence. Anastasia had not slipped away. The Romanovs had all died in that basement. The science was precise, but the symbolism was heavier. Forensic reports described entry wounds, ricochet angles, chemical burns, cold language for hot violence. Yet beneath the data lay the end of a dynasty, an empire shrunk to a shallow grave. The Soviet regime that replaced it had tried to bury both bones and memory. Time and science refused to cooperate. The story ends with reburial. In 1998, the remains of Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 daughters were interred in St. Petersburg, in the Peter and Paul Cathedral where czars had rested for centuries. Bells tolled, hymns rose, and the state that once killed them now honored them. A decade later, the remains of the 2 missing children joined their family. A fractured dynasty was made whole in death, if not in life. So what does the forensic record teach? It tells us the execution was messy, improvised, and brutal. It shows us that attempts at erasure leave their own trail. Acid scars bone, fire alters chemistry, shallow graves betray themselves. Evidence resists silence. Most of all, it reminds us that myths dissolve under the gaze of science. Anastasia was never in Paris. Alexei never smuggled to safety. Their lives ended where the bullets flew, and their bones told the truth. History loves irony. A family destroyed in a hidden cellar became one of the most studied forensic cases of the 20th century. A regime that silenced witnesses could not silence DNA. And a car park in Leicester is not the only modern place to reveal old kings. Forest soil in Yekaterinburg proved equally eloquent. Bones, once again, refused to keep secrets. Paris woke on January 21, 1793, beneath a pale winter sky. Frost clung to rooftops, the air sharp with the smell of smoke from morning fires. From the temple prison, a carriage creaked forward, wheels groaning against cobblestone. Soldiers marched on both sides, pikes lifted, eyes fixed straight ahead. Inside the carriage sat Louis Capet, once Louis XVI, King of France, now a condemned man stripped of titles. He wore a white shirt and plain breeches, no crown, no regalia, only the bearing of someone who understood the weight of final hours. Crowds lined the route. Some stood silent, their breath steaming in the cold. Others shouted curses, voices sharpened by hunger and years of resentment. The sound of drums rolled constantly, drowning words and cloaking emotion in a steady martial beat. Drummers were not there for music, but for censorship. Their rhythm erased any last appeal the king might attempt. Every thud said the same thing. Monarchy was finished. The carriage moved slowly through the city until it reached the Place de la Révolution. Thousands had gathered, filling balconies, rooftops, and streets. At the square's center loomed the guillotine. Its tall wooden frame rose stark against the morning light, the angled blade poised between its grooves. It looked less like a stage and more like an industrial machine. And in truth, that was its purpose, to turn execution into mechanical certainty. No more botched beheadings with axes, no difference between noble and commoner. The guillotine promised the same clean cut for all. Louis descended from the carriage with surprising composure. Eyewitnesses describe him as pale but steady. He removed his coat and entrusted it to a guard. A priest offered final comfort, and Louis pressed a medallion into his hand. Mounting the scaffold, he attempted to speak, raising his voice above the sea of faces. Some accounts claim he declared himself innocent of crimes against the people, asking God to forgive those who condemned him. Yet the steady beat of the drums smothered his words. The people heard little beyond fragments, a king's last defense lost in percussion. The executioners worked with practiced speed. They bound his hands, guided him forward, and laid him on the plank. The lunette closed around his neck, wood clamping flesh against wood. Forensic studies of the guillotine confirm its design. A 40-kilogram blade, angled for efficiency, sliding down greased grooves with lethal speed. The force was sufficient to sever spinal vertebrae at the second or third level of the neck, ensuring immediate unconsciousness. In theory, death was instantaneous. In practice, the debate continues. Eyewitnesses described blinking eyes, lips moving, and a flush in the cheeks. Were these signs of awareness? Or were they simply reflexes, the last electrical sparks of a nervous system cut adrift? Science favors the latter, though imagination refuses to let go. The blade fell with a single metallic thud. A gasp spread through the crowd, followed by a roar. The executioner lifted the severed head by the hair, turning it toward the masses. The square erupted. Cheers, shouts, fists raised. Some pressed forward to dip cloths in the spilled blood, eager for relics of revolution. Others stood in silence, stunned by the finality of the scene. Whatever their reaction, all understood the meaning. The king had died, not in private chambers, but before the eyes of his people as publicly as possible. Forensic clarity makes the scene almost clinical. The guillotine's blade, falling from a height of over 2 meters, delivered its strike in less than a second. Severing both carotid arteries and spinal cord, it produced rapid loss of consciousness. Compared with older methods, axes that required multiple blows, swords that faltered, the guillotine was merciful in speed. But mercy was never the real point. The point was equality. By this blade, nobles and peasants alike faced the same fate. Louis's death was proof that even monarchy could be processed like any other criminal sentence. Yet the symbolism went further. For centuries, The king's body had been considered sacred, beyond the reach of ordinary law. That morning, the sacred became sawdust. Blood pooled on wood, dripping into baskets. The monarchy ended not in ritual, but in machinery. One could almost say France industrialized death before it industrialized bread. It was efficiency applied to politics, and the crowd roared its approval. The blade had fallen, but the story did not end on the scaffold. Paris buzzed with the shock of finality. In taverns and markets, people spoke of what they had seen: the king's composure, the drums drowning his voice, the executioner raising the severed head to the crowd. Some wept, some cheered, some hurried home in silence. The monarchy, so deeply woven into French identity, was gone in a single morning. Forensic clarity makes the moment cold. Cervical vertebrae separated cleanly, carotid arteries severed, blood pressure collapsing in less than a second. Loss of consciousness should have been immediate. Yet witnesses debated what they saw. One executioner swore Louis's eyes followed him. Others insisted the lips moved, as if forming words. A woman in the crowd fainted when the head seemed to blink. Science explains these as reflexes, nerve signals firing after separation. But to the people of 1793, they looked like signs of lingering awareness. The guillotine promised equality, but it also invited morbid fascination. The crowd's reaction was part celebration, part carnival. Cloths were dipped in blood, fragments of hair taken as souvenirs. Revolutionary fervor demanded proof, and blood provided it. Forensic historians later noted that the sawdust beneath the guillotine was replaced daily, collected like relics. It was not just punishment, it was performance. The execution turned a political decision into a shared public memory, engraved not only in law but in spectacle. The guillotine itself became a character in history. Its design was praised for efficiency, but it also carried an unsettling intimacy. Unlike distant gunfire or impersonal battlefields, the guillotine brought citizens face to face with mortality. It was quick, but it was not hidden. It turned death into a civic ritual, watched by thousands, repeated again and again during the Revolution. Louis was the first king, but hardly the last victim. The blade became a rhythm of its own, falling day after day, cutting heads until fear replaced enthusiasm. Politically, the execution was meant to mark a clean break. By killing the king, the revolutionaries declared that sovereignty lay with the people. No divine right, no sacred body, only law and equality. Yet the irony runs deep. The death of Louis did not end violence. Instead, it opened the door to the terror, where the guillotine became as feared by revolutionaries as by monarchists. Heads of nobles, priests, and even former allies of the revolution rolled into the same wicker baskets. Equality before the blade proved brutally consistent. Forensic medicine kept pace with curiosity. Debates raged about whether a severed head remained conscious for a few seconds. Doctors tested reflexes, timing blinks, shouting names at heads as they were held aloft. Some claimed lips mouthed replies. Others swore expressions lingered. Today, neuroscience leans toward near-instant loss of awareness, but the fascination remains. The question reflects less about physiology than about human discomfort with the suddenness of death. Did Louis know the crowd saw him? Did he see himself raised in his executioner's hand? Science shrugs. History lingers. In the days following, pamphlets described the event in detail, circulating throughout Europe. Monarchs shuddered at the news. If the King of France could be executed like a criminal, what protection did crowns elsewhere enjoy? The revolution had not just killed a man, it had shattered an illusion. Power was no longer immortal. Thrones could splinter and heads could fall. Centuries later, the guillotine still provokes a shiver. It was at once the most humane and the most terrifying machine of its time. Humane, because it promised speed, terrifying, because it stripped away privilege and left only mortality. Louis XVI died beneath its blade, not because he was weak, but because France demanded equality carried to its most radical conclusion. His blood marked the end of monarchy and the beginning of something far less certain. So imagine the square after the crowd dispersed. The scaffold still stood, the sawdust still damp, the basket still stained. The drums were silent now, their work complete. Paris had witnessed the impossible, a king reduced to a body, a head displayed like any other. The revolution moved forward, but the echo of that morning lingered. Equality had been proven, but at a cost measured not just in blood, but in the haunting question of what comes after the king is gone. Bangkok woke gently on June 9th, 1946. The air was still, the light pale, and within the walls of Baramthaman Palace the morning seemed ordinary. Servants moved softly, preparing breakfast, footsteps muted against tiled corridors. Behind one closed door, the young king Ananda Mahidol lay in his bedroom, only 20 years old, still at the beginning of what many hoped would be a long reign. Then came the sound that shattered the calm, a single gunshot. In an instant, silence returned, heavier than before. Attendants rushed inside. They found the king on his bed, motionless, a dark wound on his forehead. Beside him lay a Colt .45 pistol, gleaming dully in the morning light. The scene was as stark as it was baffling. A monarch in his prime, alone in a private chamber, dead from a single shot. The shock was immediate. Whispers spread through the palace, footsteps hurried, voices lowered. Outside, the city still bustled, unaware that its king had just fallen. Doctors were summoned. They examined the body quickly, noting the bullet's entry and exit. The wound was clean, a through-and-through shot to the head. Powder marks suggested the gun had been fired at close range. Yet questions bloomed instantly. Was it accident? Suicide? Or something darker? Forensic logic should provide clarity, but here it offered only ambiguity. The angle of the wound was unusual, not perfectly aligned with his dominant hand. The weapon was familiar, one he had handled before, but the Colt .45 required deliberate pressure on the trigger. Could it have fired by mistake? Unlikely, yet not impossible. Those first moments were filled with confusion. Servants whispered that the king had sometimes handled pistols casually, perhaps out of curiosity. Others noted his fragile health and loneliness, hinting at despair. Still others feared a hidden hand, a shadow within the palace. 3 hypotheses formed almost immediately: accident, suicide, assassination. Each had its supporters. None had solid proof. The accident theory suggested a careless inspection of the gun, a slip, a tragic misfire. But ballistics experts know the Colt .45 is not a toy. It demands intent to fire. The suicide theory pointed to isolation, the pressures of monarchy, and the weight of expectation. Yet the trajectory did not fully match. The assassination theory raised the darkest questions. Who could enter the king's chamber, and why? Evidence was thin, the scene already disturbed, the chain of custody weak. The body had been moved, the gun touched, voices contradicting one another. Forensic science depends on precision, on preserved scenes and careful measurements. In this case, the essentials were compromised almost immediately. Witness accounts clashed. Some said they heard a cry before the shot. Others insisted it was silence followed by collapse. The weapon was examined, but fingerprints were inconclusive. The bedding, the position of the body, the angle of the wound, all could have told a story, but the story blurred as soon as people entered the room, and so uncertainty became the only certainty. The chamber was both crime scene and tragedy, but it refused to declare itself. Every detail could be read in multiple ways. Powder residue might suggest close contact or angled firing. The wound could support suicide or external attack. Even the pistol's placement near the bed raised more questions than it answered. Meanwhile, the palace was consumed by shock. Courtiers spoke in hushed tones, guards stiffened at their posts, officials drafted statements without conviction. Outside the walls, Bangkok carried on its morning routines, vendors setting up stalls, monks receiving alms, rickshaws rattling through narrow streets, unaware that history inside the palace had just taken a fatal turn. The contrast was striking. In Rome, daggers had flashed in public chambers. In England, a king fell on a muddy battlefield. In Russia, gunfire ricocheted in a crowded basement. In Paris, a guillotine blade fell before thousands. But here, in Bangkok, a king died in silence, in a bedroom, with only a single shot breaking the air. No crowd, no spectacle, only mystery. And that mystery lingered in the stillness of the palace. A young monarch lay dead, a pistol by his side, and the question echoed through the corridors. What truly happened in that room? Accident, despair, or murder? The silence offered no reply. Only the evidence could answer, and even in those first hours, it was already slipping away. The hours after the gunshot became days of questions. Officials arrived, investigators interviewed palace staff, and forensic doctors tried to reconstruct the final moments. Yet, from the beginning, the evidence resisted clarity. The room had been disturbed, the body moved, the weapon handled. Critical traces, fingerprints, powder burns, blood spatter were already compromised. What remained was fragmentary, open to interpretation, and easily bent to competing theories. The ballistics raised the most debate. A Colt .45 pistol requires firm pressure to fire. Accidental discharge is rare. The angle of the wound suggested an awkward trajectory, not quite matching the position of a right-handed shooter. Residue tests were inconclusive. Some physicians argued the shot could have been self-inflicted. Others insisted it must have come from a different hand. In courtrooms later, the same details would be presented as proof of opposite conclusions. Evidence, instead of clarity, became clay shaped by advocates. Theories hardened into camps. Supporters of the accident explanation emphasized the king's casual interest in firearms, suggesting he had simply mishandled the weapon. Advocates of suicide pointed to the pressures of his role, the fragile health that marked his short life, and the isolation of the palace. Those who suspected assassination argued that political motives abounded in post-war Thailand, that factions could have seen advantage in removing a vulnerable young monarch. None of these theories could be eliminated. None could be confirmed. Trials followed. Palace staff were arrested, accused of involvement, and brought before the court. Evidence was presented, conflicting testimonies, forensic reports, speculative reconstructions. Some witnesses spoke of cries, others of silence. Judges weighed trajectories and gunpowder patterns, as though certainty could be wrung from them. In the end, convictions were handed down, but doubt never lifted. Many observers concluded the verdicts owed as much to politics as to science. Forensic medicine has limits, especially when evidence is disturbed. A single gunshot wound offers few variables. Without clear powder burns or preserved scene photographs, possibilities multiply rather than narrow. Ballistics can measure angles, but bodies can shift, and reports often reflect the assumptions of the examiner. In Ananda's case, every measurement was shadowed by uncertainty. The science was less a scalpel than a mirror, reflecting back the biases of those who looked into it. As years passed, the silence deepened. Official accounts remained restrained, archives limited, public discussion sensitive. The young king's death became less a case to be solved and more a wound never closed. In Thailand, his memory was preserved with reverence, while the circumstances of his death were left unspoken. Abroad, historians debated theories. but each argument circled back to the same void: too little reliable evidence. What remains today is a story defined by what it cannot answer. Did Ananda die by his own hand, overwhelmed by pressures unseen? Did he die by accident, a pistol mishandled in a quiet moment? Or did unseen forces pull a trigger in the shadows of the palace? The evidence cannot say. The documents do not decide. The silence continues. There is a strange irony here. Julius Caesar's death was witnessed by senators. Richard III's body proved his battlefield wounds. The Romanovs left a cellar of bullet holes and DNA. Louis XV's guillotine fell before thousands. But Ananda Mahidol's death left only silence and a single gunshot. No crowd, no stage, only a private room where truth slipped away before anyone could preserve it. And so the story ends not with certainty, but with ambiguity. Perhaps that is its legacy, a reminder that not every royal death resolves into history books neatly. Some remain questions, haunting in their incompleteness. Forensic science thrives on evidence, but when evidence is broken, silence becomes the final verdict. In Bangkok, the room no longer stands as it did. The walls have been painted, the palace altered, time moved forward. But for those who remember, the question lingers. When a king dies in silence, what remains? Memory, reverence, and the weight of a mystery that refuses to close. History remembers crowns, but it remembers even more vividly how crowns fall. Across centuries and continents, kings met their ends not in peace but in violence, betrayal, and mystery. The stories differ in setting: chambers, battlefields, basements, public squares. But together they draw one pattern. Power rarely dies quietly. It began with Julius Caesar walking into the Curia Pompei, surrounded by men he trusted. Daggers slashed 23 times, though only one wound to the chest proved fatal. Betrayal carried more weight than steel. Brutus raised his blade, and Rome lost not only a leader, but its republic. They killed the man to save liberty, but their knives performed an autopsy instead. From Caesar's blood rose empire, a twist of irony strong enough to echo for 2,000 years. Richard III met his fate in mud and steel. At Bosworth, 1485, the last Plantagenet king gambled everything on a final charge. His horse fell, his helmet was torn away, and weapons rained upon him until his skull split. Stripped, mocked, and buried without dignity, he was remembered as a villain with a crooked back. 5 centuries later, archaeologists dug beneath a Leicester car park and found his bones. Forensic science corrected the stage. Scoliosis, yes, but not the monster Shakespeare painted. He fought, he fell, and his skeleton told the truth that propaganda had denied. The Romanovs died in chaos far from battlefields. In 1918, a family of 11 was herded into a basement in Yekaterinburg. Gunfire cracked, bullets ricocheted, jewels in corsets turned to cruel armor, and bayonets finished what smoke could not. Bodies were hauled to the forest, burned, doused with acid, and buried in shallow graves. For decades the truth was hidden, feeding myths of Anastasia's escape. But DNA has no patience for legend. By the 1990s, science identified them all. Bones ended the fairy tale and confirmed the cellars' silence. Louis XVI died not in secrecy, but before a crowd. On January 21st, 1793, drums rolled as he mounted the scaffold at the Place de la Révolution. The guillotine's blade fell with mechanical certainty, severing his head in less than a second. Some swore the eyes blinked, others that the lips moved. But whether awareness lingered or not, the crowd roared. The king had died like any man, proof that equality could be written in blood. Yet the irony persisted. The death of a king did not end violence. It opened the reign of terror, where the blade fell again and again until fear silenced cheers. And then came the quietest of them all. Ananda Mahidol, king of Siam, only 20 years old, found dead in his bedroom with a Colt .45 at his side. A single gunshot, no witnesses, no certainty. Accident, suicide, assassination. Each theory had its champions. None prevailed. Trials followed, verdicts delivered, but doubt never lifted. Unlike Caesar or Louis, there was no crowd, no theater. Unlike Richard or the Romanovs, no battlefield or cellar scarred by many wounds. Only a closed room, a single bullet, and silence that endures to this day. Taken together, these deaths form a strange chorus. Caesar betrayed by allies, Richard cut down in mud, the Romanovs extinguished in smoke, Louis humbled by the guillotine, Ananda lost in mystery. Each story is unique, but all point to the same lesson. Thrones are fragile, crowns are brittle, and power, however grand, rests on the most uncertain seat in the world. So what do we learn from the corpses of kings? That betrayal cuts deeper than steel, that propaganda can bury truth, but bones will rise to correct it, that myths thrive in silence until science pries them apart, that equality, once proven on a scaffold, can be more terrifying than comforting, and that sometimes the absence of answers is more haunting than any verdict. Raise a glass, then, to the irony of it all. The men who believed themselves chosen by fate, anointed by God, or born to rule ended as case studies for archaeologists, pathologists, and storytellers. Power promises glory, but history keeps the receipts, and they are written not in gold, but in blood, bone, and silence.